Hi, and welcome to a special higher education edition of InstDivision. I'm Glenn Reynolds. We've got a higher education bubble that's bursting, but then we've got a lot of other things, including kind of a moral panic going on at our colleges and universities everywhere. And I brought in an expert to talk about it. He's Casey Johnson. He's a history professor at Brooklyn College. He blogs at Minding the Campus. And with Stuart Taylor, he wrote a book called Until Proven Innocent: Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustice of the Duke Lacrosse Case. And he looked into that case where Duke lacrosse players were railroaded over false rape allegations. In the end, Duke wound up paying big settlements to the players, and so did Durham. It was a national scandal. But now we find colleges seem to have learned nothing from this. What's wrong here? Welcome, Casey.
Thanks for having me.
So your son gets into Harvard, and you're all excited. You're going to spend, I don't know, $250K to send him there. Should you be worried he's going to wind up branded a rapist?
I'm afraid that now actually you should be quite worried. Harvard is the latest of a series of schools which since 2011 have revised their sexual assault procedures under pressure from the federal government. And Harvard's in some ways is the most extreme with regards to due process. The campus disciplinary panel was essentially removed entirely from the Harvard process. Instead, the way it now works is that there's a two-person investigative team which interviews both the accuser and the accused. The accused student doesn't know what the accuser says, never has access to the entire array of evidence, and doesn't have a right to counsel in the interview process. And if this two-person investigative committee, by a 50.01% threshold, concludes that a rape occurred, the student is branded a rapist for life with no meaningful chance of appeal.
And you can literally be branded a rapist based on an anonymous accusation. Is that right?
That's correct. It's one of the intriguing elements of the Harvard provision. It has two unusual and very disturbing due process elements. The first is that it allows anonymous accusations. It concedes that it may be more difficult to prosecute these accusations, but put yourself in the position of a student who's been accused of rape. You don't know who your accuser is. And the second element of this Harvard plan is that you can actually be accused after you graduate from Harvard. And so 4, 5, 7 years down the line, you can be hauled back before a Harvard process, be branded a rapist, and it's not entirely clear how then Harvard can punish you. So these very, very unfriendly to due process provisions, it's almost as if the elite universities are trying to one-up themselves to break down due process protections more so than their academic rivals.
I actually suspect there's something like that going on, that the people in these disciplinary boards are in fact playing mostly to the crowd of their fellow disciplinary bureaucrats at other schools than anything else. Well, this is basically the result of pressure from the Obama administration, right? This goes back to that Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education that accused schools of not doing enough. And yet, am I not right that, in fact, just like national rape rates generally, sexual assault rates on campuses are plunging?
That's correct. All statistical data suggests that they've declined by a substantial fraction over the last 20 years. And what's so remarkable about this issue is that data appears to be irrelevant. If there are signs that there have been more reports of sexual assault, there was, for instance, at Penn State between 2011 and 2012, that data is cited as, okay, we have a sexual assault problem. If there isn't, there have been a number of schools that reported 0 sexual assaults over the last 3 years. That too is cited as a problem. The argument is, well, victims are afraid somehow of reporting. So we've entered into an environment in which statistical data is irrelevant. However it comes out, the anti-due process crowd will argue we have a rape culture problem on campus.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if this isn't actually a very clever psychological warfare mechanism run by people on the right to basically undermine the most prestigious schools by causing them to sort of eat themselves. And it almost looks like this, doesn't it?
You do wonder. I mean, because the rational justifications for these sorts of policies are very difficult to discern.
So it's not just what universities are doing and even what the Obama administration is doing. We now have a bill sponsored by Claire McCaskill, a Democratic senator from Missouri, but which Marco Rubio has inexplicably joined, which basically takes the Harvard approach nationally, more or less, right? This bill is new, and in fact, the actual bill language isn't out yet. All we have is sort of their outline. But can you just give people sort of a quick run-through of what this bill does?
Sure. So earlier this spring, Senator McCaskill, who is a former prosecutor, keep it in mind, so she's someone who should know the importance of due process, held three what were billed as town hall meetings with a couple other Democratic senators, Gillibrand and Blumenthal, in which they explored the alleged crisis of sexual assault in education. And these town halls brought together solely people from one side, Title IX administrators, people who claim that they were victims of rape. There were no defense attorneys invited, no civil libertarians invited, no students who had been falsely accused who were invited. And in the aftermath of this, McCaskill announced that she was planning legislation to address the problem, which was introduced this morning. Six senators co-sponsoring, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. Now, some of this is boilerplate material that is potentially problematic, but likely not serious. I mean, the bill calls for more reporting and these sorts of things. But there are a handful of provisions that are really quite remarkable. The first, and this gives you a sense of the thinking behind the sponsors of this legislation, is that in the legislation itself, the sexual assault accuser is referred to as the victim. But of course, in a sexual assault case, the accuser doesn't become a victim until we know there's been a rape. Before that, the person may very well be a false accusation. So there's a presumption that the accuser has been victimized. So it's essentially a presumption of guilt in the word choice. The second odd provision of this bill is that it calls for closer coordination between colleges and law enforcement, which is in itself not a bad thing at all. But it gives to the accuser or the victim, in the wording of the bill, a veto power over that process. So, for instance, if this bill becomes law, if a college investigation finds that an accuser has been raped, it would be obligated to share that information with police if the accuser agreed to do so. But if the college investigation found out that the accuser had lied and therefore was criminally liable for filing potentially false charges, it would be forbidden from sharing that information with police. The last sort of shaky provision of
this. The term kangaroo court is not too strong here.
It's not at all, but it reflects this general mindset that these new college procedures must be, quote unquote, victim friendly, and to give substantial deference to the accuser in a way that would be unimaginable in a court of law.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting to me to see how this is shaping up, and it is really evidence, I think, that. I think it's a cynical ploy. I mean, my own political take is that they don't expect this bill to pass, that in fact it's just there to support the war on women narrative between now and 2014 and really 2016, sort of battle space preparation for Hillary. I almost think that what Republicans ought to do is double down, drastically increase the penalties on universities, allow private attorneys to sue universities for treble damages, and just ram this through and bring down the whole higher education system as a lesson for the future. But I doubt they'll do it. I suspect that the reason why people like Marco Rubio are signing on to it is to try to blunt the whole war on women appeal of it. Or it may just be Rubio's clueless. He got sucked into a bad bipartisan deal by Chuck Schumer a while back on immigration, so he may just be a sucker for the phony bipartisanship. One more question. We've got a higher education bubble that is sort of deflating. Colleges are already having trouble filling their seats, even some fairly Tony colleges. And they're especially having trouble filling their seats by people who are willing to pay full freight. And even more so, colleges at all levels are having a hard time getting anywhere close to 50% male enrollment. And without that, they have a lot of problems, including the fact that the better female students don't really want to go to a school that's 65, 70% women either. is this going to make things worse? And is there some point at which the admissions and fundraising bureaucracy collides with the diversity and sexual harassment bureaucracy to make a change in this, or not? Is it a religious thing?
Right. I think that is the open question here, because the one thing we can be absolutely certain of, that there really can be no debate over this, is that in the next 3 to 5 years, there will be an expanding number. It might be dozens, it might be hundreds, it might theoretically even be more than that, of students, male students, who are branded rapists by their schools who are actually innocent. And we're seeing signs of this already. I mean, these stories are beginning to filter into the press. I mean, I obviously cover them. James Toronto did this great piece in the Wall Street Journal over an Auburn case several months ago. But more and more of these cases will start coming out. In particular, we'll see more and more lawsuits. We already have more than a dozen of them filed against colleges and universities by falsely convicted male students demanding federal civil rights or state action. And so when we think of a hostile environment, this will create the kind of environment that a lot of people consider to be hostile. And at that point, I suspect we will see cooler heads step in within the university process. I mean, we've even seen this through the American Council of Education, which has been very skeptical of McCaskill's efforts. So you can see, at least theoretically, light at the end of the tunnel, but the process to get there means that we're going to be branding dozens and probably hundreds of students rapists for life. And keep in mind, this has a huge impact. It's not as if a school can brand you a rapist and no one will ever find out about it. You're likely to be expelled. You're likely to struggle to get into another school. If you go into a job that requires any kind of background check, no chance of getting a sort of job. So these are life-altering decisions and action that colleges are undertaking at this time.
So one of the things, lessons from this, I guess, is if the bill passes, I should buy stock in online education because,
Yes.
My daughter went to an online high school, and one of my friends said, "That's great. Nobody ever got shot or knocked up in an online school." Well, nobody ever got falsely accused of rape at an online school either. So it's, it's likely to accelerate the trend of people leaving traditional brick and mortar colleges for other approaches.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, exit question. What should happen? Imagine that you were yourself a senator, which would be great news for the Republic, probably bad news for you personally. But if you were, and you were going to do a bill, what would your bill look like?
Well, sexual assault is a crime. And so what we need is closer coordination between universities and local law enforcement to prosecute crimes. Let's assume that the statistics behind this are accurate, and I have very strong suspicions about that, but let's assume they are. The administration and Senator McCaskill have claimed that 1 in 5 women are victims of sexual assault while they're at college. That means we have a violent crime wave sweeping the nation. The typical college campus would have a higher rate of violent crime than most dangerous urban areas. And if that's the case, we need law enforcement to have a greater role on campus, police patrols, coordination between campus and police to ensure that victims who are actually victims are willing to come forward. And what's striking throughout this process, beginning in 2011 with the Dear Colleague letter, then with the White House Task Force earlier this year, and basically continuing with the McCaskill bill, is there's almost no desire to bring in law enforcement and have law enforcement, trained police officers, medical examiners, prosecutors doing the investigation rather than university officials. And that really is what needs to be done.
Yeah, it's almost as if the goal is to make colleges a hostile environment for men.
The goal, and there was a striking admission by a Stanford law professor named Michelle Dauber when Stanford redid their procedures. Dauber basically discouraged accusers at Stanford from filing police reports. She wanted instead to file reports through Stanford, and she celebrated the fact that after Stanford changed their procedures, the procedures resulted in more rapists. There seems to be a strong ideological goal to have more rapists identified, and that really is one of the key motivating factors behind all of this movement.
Well, We hunted witches and burned women. Now we're hunting rapists and burning men, I suppose.
Yes.
But my favorite take on this of all came from Iowa Hawk, who put out a tweet where he said apparently the view of college administrators is that colleges are cesspits of racism and sexual assault that everyone should attend.
Right, and spend $200,000 for the process. It's quite remarkable.
I predict it will prove a poor marketing strategy. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that was Professor Casey Johnson. He's a history professor at Brooklyn College. He blogs at Minding the Campus, which, by the way, you really should check out. That's a terrific site for keeping track of all kinds of higher ed stuff. And he's the author with Stuart Taylor of Until Proven Innocent, Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustice of the Duke Lacrosse Case. Well, thank you for coming here. We hope you found this episode less than shameful, and we'll be back in a while. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.